Hi, I'm Julie Levitt-Learson for Fairfield University, and welcome to my lecture slideshow for fashion in ancient Greece. When I ask you to picture the ancient Greeks, is this what comes to mind in your head? People draped in white columns of fabric, maybe with gold gladiator sandals, yes? Hold on to those thoughts and hopefully I will change your mental picture a little bit. So I have here two sets of statues, and they are separated by about 2,000 years, and they're across the Mediterranean from each other. A couple on the left should be familiar to you from our time in ancient Egypt. So they're from about 2400, 2300 BCE. On the right, we have a male and female youthful figures, a kouros and a kora, or caryatid, from anywhere between 600 BCE to about 420 BCE. And these are both from Athens. Now, looking at these two sets of figures, you might be able to see some similarities in how they're dressed, in how they stand, in how the human artist is thinking about the human form as they make their art. Let's look a little deeper. One thing that I find both of these cultures seem to have in common is that they both have a deep-rooted emotional connection to their past. Remember, the Greeks, their theater and their art at this time, a lot of it was the subject matter of myths and legends and battles and stories from in their distant past. So almost as if our movies and television shows were all about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And that sentiment of looking back towards the golden age of the past is not dissimilar to that Egyptian mindset as well. Couple of more sets of images to compare. Again, two figures from ancient Egypt. They're from the about 1200 BCE. And then on the right, we have the Delphi charioteer and a statue of Hestia, the Greek goddess of the hearth. And they're both from about 500 to 475 BCE. So closer in time, but still pretty far apart. Again, let's look at silhouette and let's look at texture of these two, right? The garments are similar, right? Fine woven fabric that's draped around the body and often finely pleated. We go forward in time about 100 years, or about 330, 325 BCE. These are Roman copies of Greek statues from that time, but close enough. On the left here, we have Apollo Belvedere, who's a Greek god translated into a Roman god. And on the right, we have Diana of Versailles, again, a Greek goddess who's been given a new Roman name. And as you can see, these statues look quite different from the ones that we were just looking at, right? There's a lot of dynamism, there's life, they seem to be in motion, their drapery is flowing and flapping around them. There's animation here. So the Greeks have started to really develop their own style compared to those earlier slides. And I put this cartoon in here just for fun. But what's going on in those statues is the sculptor is using contrapposto, which is this way of posing the human figure so that the weight rests on one leg instead of being evenly resting on both legs. So what that does is that it frees the leg that isn't holding up the body. You can bend it at the knee. And when you shift that weight, the hips, the shoulders, the head, everything tilts, and that suggests relaxation, a sort of casualness and this internal movement that creates this sense of liveliness. So very antithetical to Egyptian sensibilities, very key to the Greek sense of beauty in art. And I'm including this here in this lecture video on fashion history because this new realistic way of showing the human form is kind of a boon to costume designers because it shows us how the fabric draped and fell and moved, and we can start to make guesses about what it was made of and how it was made. Okay, so if you remember, we said that Greeks used a lot of wool in their clothing because Greek land was particularly well suited to herding sheep and goats. Greece is relatively warm for a climate, but colder than Egypt, right? Not in a desert. We're in mountains, and those get cold at night. We're on a peninsula, so surrounded by ocean, so it can get breezy. So wool is going to keep us warmer than linen. We used to think that the Greeks didn't really use linen at all because we didn't think linen grew well in Greece, but we have come to find some new information that suggests they did have some, but also remember Greeks were traders and they could trade across the ocean with Egypt and with Syria and with other places in North Africa, and they could get linen. We also think that they were able to import cotton from India and silk from China later on. If you remember back to our history lecture on this era, right, the Greek Empire expanded to kind of encroach into those parts of the world and certainly was able to trade with those places. So these would have been luxury textiles that would have been for the very wealthy, but they were certainly possible. And rumor has it that the Greeks unraveled the silk that they received from China and then rewove it to their liking. I'm not sure if that's true, but it reminds me of that Greek myth about Penelope unweaving and unraveling the shroud she's weaving for her father and then weaving it day after day to kind of fend off her suitors. And Greek women of all social classes were expert spinners and weavers. Women were expected to create the textiles for their own homes and families, for their households. But they also, if they were of means, they could spin and weave to make textiles for trade and for selling. And if one was, say, a princess or a queen or the head of a city state household, one would make and distribute textiles as diplomatic royal gifts. Spinning and weaving plays a really important role in Greek mythology and literature and art. We've already mentioned Penelope, who's in the bottom right there, sitting at her loom. The top right is a detail from a pot depicting the legend of Arachne, who was a young Greek woman who was so skilled at weaving, she challenged the goddess Athena essentially to a weave off. And when she won, Athena got so mad, she hit Arachne with the shuttle from the loom, and Arachne got turned into a spider. So she was cursed to weave forever and ever and ever. On the left-hand side, we have one of the three fates. These were women who spun thread, who measured the length of it and then cut it. And each thread was the length of a mortal's life. And when you cut it, you died. All this to say is that weaving was very important to the Greeks, and they were quite good at it. As you can see here from these images from different pottery, you can see that the textiles were colored, they were decorated, they have patterns woven throughout the fabric, and they have patterns woven along the edges as well. And we think that the ancient Greeks were actually rather fond of bright colors. We have discovered that their statuary was painted. It just looks white now because the paint has flaked off the marble over the centuries of exposure to the elements or being buried under the ground. And different museums, like the Smithsonian or the Polychromy Research Project in Germany, have been using different methods to kind of do forensic scans and determine the original colors on the statuary. And so here are some best guesses as to what they might have actually looked like. And so we can assume that this bright coloration and pattern carried over into the textiles themselves. So here you can see an attempt to recreate garments using weaving techniques and dyes that were available to ancient Greeks by a contemporary scholar. And the inspiration is this fresco image from a palace on the island of Crete off the coast of Greece. But for all of that, weaving is still a very labor-intensive process, as is spinning. So like the Egyptians, Greek people kept their clothing simple and versatile and reusable. So lots of large rectangles of fabric that were draped, pinned, and belted into place. We're going to start with women's dress, and there are basically three main items: the piplos, the chiton, in the Himation. So this here is a piplos, which is as distinctive an ancient Greek garment as we're going to get, seems to have been exclusively worn by women. It's a woolen rectangle that is wrapped around the body and either left open on one side or sewn shut. And then the top edge is folded down to make a really deep cuff. And that cuff depth could vary from midriff to the hips. Here's a drawing showing how you take that rectangle of cloth and wrap it around the body and then hold it in place. It's secured at the shoulders with a couple of pins. And here's what some of those pins would have looked like: some straight pins or this kind of arch bowed fibula, which is kind of like a Greek safety pin or a brooch. Here are some less fancy ones. Those were gold. These are iron or might have been bronze that have turned green over time. But pretty hefty brooch pins to hold that heavy fabric in place at the shoulders. But they also had buttons, and here's a set of terracotta and bronze buttons that have been carved with a little Gorgon's head, which is a mythical monster from Greek myth. And then to control all of this fabric that is hanging from your shoulders by these two pins, the peplos was often belted. And you could either belt it under the cuff, like this example here on the left, or you could belt it on top of the cuff, like this image on the right. So you can see there's a little bit of variation to your look here. Another staple of women's wear in ancient Greece was the chiton. So very similar, it's a rectangle that gets wrapped around the body and pinned in place at the shoulders and then belted. You can kind of think of it as like a peplos without a cuff. Other differences, it seems to be of a lighter, finer textile than the peplos. It might have been linen, at least some of the time. Might have been wool, but if it was wool, it was still a finer thread that was used. You can see that by the kind of extra number of drapes, and the pleats and folds of this seem to be smaller and finer, and it seems to be clinging more towards the body. It feels lighter and more flowy. Now the chiton came in two styles, Doric, which you see here. So as you can see, it really is just like the peplos, but without the cuff. And then there's another style called the Ionic or Ionian, which we'll get into in a minute. Here's the Ionic chiton, which, as you can see, the Doric chiton is basically a tank dress. The Ionic chiton has sleeves. So you can see that the fabric for an Ionic chiton is a bit larger. You can see that it is sewn on that open edge so that it creates a tube. And it's held in place this time not just by two pins on the shoulders, but by a series of pins along the top of the arm to make this really kind of pretty draped sleeve. And then it's belted. Now, the chiton seems to have kind of replaced the peplos around the early 6th century BCE. We're not quite sure why. The peplos still gets depicted in art, but we think that men and women, and then just women, were wearing chitons in the day-to-day. There's a little myth associated with that, where, according to Herodotus, during one of the wars, a messenger came back to a village and had bad news for the women that their husband had all been killed, and the women took their fibulae out of their chitons and stabbed the messenger to death with them. And because of that, the government banned large chiton pins, and so therefore it required a style change in fashion. It's a fantastic story. I doubt it's true. Now, for all that, there is a little bit of underwear or garment support going on with these Greek garments, and this is called a strophion. It's a breastband. It's kind of like the original cross your heart bra, which could be worn over the chiton. As you can see, it's just a belt of fabric that gets crisscrossed and then tied, and it just kind of holds things in place, holds the fabric in place, might offer a little bit of support to the bosom. Here's an example of how you might wear it. Okay, so Greek women dressed in layers. So you've got either your peplos or your chiton. You might have your strophion on. Over that, if you're going outside in public anywhere, you're going to have another layer called the himation. You might have your hair up in a headscarf, and on your feet you might have sandals. But as you can see, women are dressing in layers. Here's an example. This is a statue of two sisters, and you can see the different layers of their clothing like we've just discussed. And here are some statues of Greek women with their himatians on display. And as you can see, you can wear this rectangle of fabric in many different ways. You can roll it up, you can cover your arms, you can wear it off to one side. It's got a lot of variety built into it. Here are some examples of how one might drape it. And as you can see, women do not seem to pin or otherwise attach the himation. It's just a draped garment. And you can even take one edge of your himation and pull it up over your head to make a head covering or a veil. But let's talk a little bit about menswear. Here is a detail from a pot, and this is featuring a student and his teacher. This is from Athens, about 450 BCE. And what do you notice about these two men in comparison to all of the images of women I've just shown you? Well, the teacher who's seated on the right is probably also wearing a Hamatian. Men wore this garment too. But as you can see from these two images here, men tended to wear the Hamatian as their base garment. There's not another garment underneath this, whereas women always wore their Hamatian over their chiton or piplos. You can see that here in this statue to the one side, a man and probably his wife and then a child. This is from a funeral statuary piece, and the man has his Hamatian over a bare chest. She has her Hamatian over a chiton. And you can see here some men and some women together. The women are much more covered up than the men. Man on the left has a Hamatian with nothing on underneath it. Man on the right might be a chiton that has left his chest bare. He's just kind of like rolled that down around his waist. Women have several layers on. And here are two men seated playing a game of dice. And again, they're wearing their Hamatians. And again, they are kind of casual, draped around their waists, not up around their torso. And the thing with Hamatians, right, with this long draped rectangle of fabric, you can wrap it around the body in various ways. And with men wearing this as their main garment, there were very particular and precise ways to wear it for different occasions, for different groups of people. For the Greek man, to be well dressed was to be properly draped, which kind of reminds me a little bit of the Indian sari. And now remember, there's lots of trade going on, right? Because Alexander had conquered much of the Middle East and kind of stretched all the way to India. So even some iconically Greek items of fashion might have, quote, foreign roots. Now, back when that chiton replaced the piplos, for a while both men and women wore this long ankle-length tube, and then it kind of became a woman's garment only. But there were a few variations for men. And so there's this garment, which at first glance looks exactly like a chiton, but it is a little bit different. And this is called, as best as I can pronounce it, a xystis, which is kind of like Greek sportswear. These figures here are all charioteers, and you can see they've got a wide belt at the waist, and they've got some strapping across the shoulders to hold this tube of fabric in place. And it's kind of snug to the body and kind of trying to control that fullness. When men did still wear the chiton, they wore a much shorter version. The women's chiton went all the way to the ankles. Men's chitons kind of hung out at the knee length. Or they had this garment called the exomus, which is basically a one-shoulder chiton. Again, it's belted at the waist, you can see, but it's definitely just draped over one shoulder, leaving one side of the chest bare. Now, as you can see, this is a much more practical garment compared to the Hamatian. So this tended to be the garment for athletes, sometimes for soldiers, for laborers, people who actually needed to get physical with their work. And occasionally, you will see a Greek woman wearing an exomus. But when that happens, she's usually pretty masculine. For example, Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, sometimes is pictured wearing an exomus. A typical Greek woman would not bare her breast in public. So here we've got on the left a statue of an Amazon woman, and the word Amazon means no breast. The legend is that Amazon women cut off one breast so that they could properly hold their bow and arrow in place. We doubt that's actually true, but here is a garment that maybe is kind of contributing to that myth. On the right, we have a statue of a Spartan girl in an exomus, and she is probably competing in some sort of physical martial activity. As I said, we often see images of Greek men in the nude, particularly young Greek men. These are three statues from different eras in the Greek centuries. They are athletes, they're sometimes soldiers, they're just sometimes young men. In contrast, we very rarely see undressed or semi-undressed women in Greek statuary. One big exception is when we're talking about Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, and these are three statues of her. We've got on the left there, probably the one you know, the Venus de Milo, which is currently at the Louvre Museum in Paris. In the middle, we have a statue of Aphrodite where she's got a very, very thin Doric chiton and then a thicker Hamatian draped over her hips, right? And that chiton is so thin, We can see the outline of her body. We can see her nipples. We can see her belly button. If she didn't have that Himation artfully draped, we could probably see other bits as well. And then on the right, we have another one. Again, very, very thin fabric. We can see lots of details through it, and she's partially uncovered. This would not be acceptable public wear for your average Greek woman. Gotta be a goddess. So if men's main garment is that Himation, which is an outerwear garment for women, then what do you wear if you're a guy and you need outerwear? Well, you wear one of a number of shorter, smaller capes, like this one, which is called a chlamys, right? Again, another big old rectangle of fabric that's probably wool. It's probably thicker, right? Probably going to help you stay warm and dry if you are traveling. And you wear it pinned on one shoulder and then artfully draped. Looks like Himation underneath is optional. Here are some more examples of the chlamys in statuary. On the left-hand side, there's a statue of Hermes, messenger to the gods. And on the right is just a mortal young man in a chlamys with definitely no chiton underneath. Hermes might be wearing a chiton under there. It's a little hard to tell. Here are some examples of footwear, both masculine and feminine. Leather boots and sandals with lots of lacing. I wanted to talk a little bit about hair. This is some styles from the archaic period for men. So you can see it's rather stylized. It's not really realistic representation of the hair, but it's showing us coils and curls and maybe braids, right? Young men tend to be clean shaven. Older men tend to have beards. They probably used olive oil and mixed with perfume to get those coils perfectly arranged. Women's hair in their archaic period also coiled and possibly braided, but longer than men's. And here's an example from our old Fairfield University. On the left-hand side is a detail from a statue of a caryatid from the Parthenon in Athens. And on the right-hand side is a former Fairfield student who back in 2009, I think it was, our art history department did a caryatid project where they studied these statues and recreated the hairstyles. So here's what it looks like in the idealized art form, and here's what it looks like on a woman. Here are some hairstyles from later on in the Hellenic period. Again, we've still got that wavy curly hair, which is probably quite common to people living in Greece. But it's lost a lot of that like stiff styled coil sense to it, and it looks a little bit more like beachy waves. You can see the youth is clean shaven. Older men tend to have beards. They're a little less sharply pointed than those beards we saw in the earlier images, and the hair on top of their head is a little bit longer and kind of tousled and wild. Here's one example of a Hellenistic hairstyle for women, right? So they kept their hair long, but they tied it up instead of being braided down their backs or in these loose coils over their shoulders. It's knotted up and held in place with cloths or metal hair bands of various styles. Here's an example of a style that we call the Grecian knot, right? It's just a little bun at the back of the head, and she's got a little fillet holding it in place like a headband. I wanted to show you a few images of headwear. Wasn't very common for especially men to wear headgear in ancient Greece, but if one was traveling, wearing a wide, broad-brimmed, flat hat might be a good thing to have with you to keep the sun and the rain off your face and your back. On the left-hand side there, we have a picture of Oedipus, who was a traveler, and he traveled to the city of Thebes and battled the Sphinx. And so there he is. Here's another kind of hat that men might wear. As you can see, warriors tended to favor this hat. It's just a little pointed conical cap called a pilos. Here's some headwear for women. Woman on the right has some pitasses, just like the men. On the left, this headpiece is called a stefane. Let's talk a little bit about jewelry. We could do a whole lecture on it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just some kind of like big generalizations. This is from the archaic period. They tended to really favor geometric shapes. You can see, beads, circles, triangular pendants. They've got necklaces, earrings, rings, and bracelets or armbands. Here's some examples of jewelry from the Hellenic period. As you can see, more complex shapes, more detailed work. These are gold. Gold looks very thin. Remember, Greeks didn't have a lot of gold on hand. They had to import it and trade for it, so it was expensive. So they tended to have very thin pieces of gold when they made their gold jewelry. Here's some more examples of earrings from the Hellenic period. We've still got that love of the geometric shapes going on. But as you can see, the artistry is quite well developed. They're incorporating beads of various kinds and some enamel painting, and they're starting to create, shapes from nature in there and very ornate shaping of the jewelry. Some gold necklaces from the period, lots and lots and lots of little moving parts. And on the left-hand side, they're incorporated with amber beads. A couple more necklaces, again, more beads. And on the right-hand side, we've got a little image of a butterfly worked in there into the jewels. And here are some armbands, right? That one on the right in the image of a snake seems to be borrowing from Egyptian art ideas. On the left there, we've got something more of like a torque, which looks more Celtic to me, but could have come from somewhere else in the Mediterranean. We've got a signet ring, and then we have another bracelet with some enamel work and jewels embedded in there. Really briefly wanted to show you some images of armor. Again, that cuirass, that chest plate, and like the Egyptians had, could be made of leather, could be made of bronze or iron, and then helmets. Greeks covered their heads when they went to war. And it seems like they made effort to protect their face because there were archers and arrows could fly very fast and very far and land very hard in the soft parts of the body. Now, sometimes warriors went into battle naked, except for their helmet, and it looks like some shin guards called greaves there on the left-hand side. But oftentimes, if they could afford it, they would wear body armor. So here's an example of a cuirass with a pleated skirt to cover below the waistline, but still allowing that freedom of movement. And here we have two images of gods associated with war. We have Athena on the left. That's right, Athena, a goddess, a woman, goddess of war. And on the right, we have Ares, the Greek god of war, the main war god. Ares is naked except for a chlamys and a helmet. Athena is fully dressed. She too has a crested helmet. And then you can see draped over her left arm, she has what is called the aegis, her protective shield, kind of like a cloak, kind of like a shield. But on it, you can see that face. That's the image of Medusa the Gorgon. Greek myth has it that Perseus cut off the head of Medusa. She had the power to turn men to stone just by looking at them. She had snakes in her hair. Athena took the head. She put it on her aegis. Last thing I wanted to show you are some depictions of non-Greeks in Greek art. People who did not speak Greek, the Greeks considered, quote, barbarians. Doesn't necessarily mean they were uncouth, the way we think of the word barbarian, but meaning a non-Greek speaker. But they tended to be depicted differently. You can see this kind of floppy cap they're wearing. That's called a Phrygian cap. If someone is wearing that, we're thinking, aha, you're not from Greece. Another way to tell if someone was not from Greece is if they were wearing trousers. These are barbarians from Persia as depicted in Greek art at various times. You can see they've got highly decorated clothing, but they've got pants, and Greeks did not wear pants. They're also wearing this kind of tight-fitted jacket, not at all like those billowy draped garments held in place, obviously serving good practical use here if one is a warrior. And then on the bottom, you can see that Archer has been colorized in what we think they might have looked like. So definitely brightly colored, brightly patterned, could have been woven, could have been embroidered. But if they're wearing pants, they're not a Greek.